Hello everyone. So today we'll be talking about cognitive development in middle adulthood. So last time when we finished, we had been talking about some of the physical development that we see happening in the years which make up middle adulthood, which is roughly from 40 years to 60 years. Right? So we're going to look at, when we think about cognitive changes that are happening in middle adulthood, most of us are usually thinking in terms of declines, right? However, it's not necessary that all of our cognitive abilities are on the decline. It's also possible that certain cognitive abilities are, showing gains. Before we get into that, we can also see how when we consider cognitive changes happening in middle adulthood, the sort of research that we do in order to find what sort of development is taking place, right? That can also have an impact on our findings, right? So what you find is that a lot of times in developmental psychology, we, can be employing these two different research styles. So one is more of a cross-sectional research style, right? And the other is a longitudinal research style, right? What happens in a cross-sectional research design is that you study two different groups of individuals, right, at different points in their lives. So for example, you could have one group of individuals who are, let's say, between 20 to 40 years old, right? And then another group of individuals who are between 40 to 60 years of age, right? Why we're doing this is because we want to look at, how are these people differing in terms of cognitive capacities, right? So, these are people in middle adulthood. How are they different from these people who are in their early adulthood, right? Are there declines in their cognitive development? Are there, any gains? How is their memory working? How are they dividing attention? How, what does their processing speed look like? So all of these are questions that we try to answer through cross-sectional research. The advantage of doing cross-sectional research obviously is that we don't have to wait for this group to age, right? And therefore, our research findings can come a lot more quickly. However, one of the things that you do find is that there might be some, sort of impacts that might be generational. So there might be cohort effects. It might be that this group of, individuals were not given the same quality of education, or that educational advances have been made ever since, you studied these two different groups. Right. But, what happens in a longitudinal design is that you compare the same group of individuals. So let's say here you picked out, this group of individuals, which was in early adulthood, and you tested them on various cognitive abilities, and then you wait for them to enter middle adulthood, which is this time period, and then you do tests on them again, right? So here what you keep constant is that it's the same group of people. So it's not that your two different groups have been subjected to different levels or different levels of the quality of education that they had, right? And this is something that we find. So we see this when we look at this diagram here, this graph here. What we see is that the blue line here is the results that we have from cross-sectional research. This is where we're comparing two different groups. And what we see here is that the declines here are, a lot more exaggerated than what we see. They're a lot more profound here than they're here, right? When we look at longitudinal research. And the reason for this is that, here we're obviously comparing two different groups of individuals who have been subjected to different qualities of education. Right. So yes. So what we see is that these declines are mostly due to these very profound declines are mostly due to cohort effects. Anyway, moving on to the next topic. Next, what we talk about is what is gain and what is declining. So when we look at declines, right? So one of the things that we see is declining is something that's called fluid intelligence. I'm not sure how many of you have come across this term before. And what you're gaining in middle adulthood is something that's called crystallized intelligence. Now, what do you think would be differences between these, or what exactly would be fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence? Now, fluid intelligence, another thing that you see is that fluid intelligence peaks during young adulthood, and after that it is shown to have a decline in middle adulthood. So basically fluid intelligence has a lot to do with something that's called perceptual speed, right? It's basically how quickly you can size up information and make a judgment about it. It's how quickly how fast your working memory works. It's you looking at different spatial relationships and making quick decisions about, for example, where to throw a ball so that it would hit a mark, right? So all of those components are what fluid intelligence is comprised of, whereas crystallized intelligence is something that is made up of years of experience and expertise, right, in a given domain, and this is something that's culturally valued, right? So crystallized intelligence is something that you've accumulated. It's accumulated knowledge of socially desirable areas or topics, right? Whereas fluid intelligence is more how well you can sort of think on your feet, how quickly you can think on your feet, right? How quickly you can make certain decisions about spatial organization, about different kinds of, so for example, when you're doing speed tests that check for your IQ in some way. So that is also where fluid intelligence is playing a part. Just to make it clearer, let's just look at this longitudinal study, which is called Shy's Seattle longitudinal study. And what we see there is that we're looking at these different cognitive components. Some of them are fluid and others are crystallized, and we see how they change. So we see how they change over the lifespan. So here what you see is that this blue line here, this is basically showing perceptual speed. Now perceptual speed is a big component of fluid intelligence, right? And here what you see is that there's a steady decline beginning from age 25, right? And it's at its lowest at 88 years, and obviously it's declining as you age further, right? Then you have something that's called inductive reasoning, right? And what you see with inductive reasoning is that there are gains actually. It's peaking mostly during middle adulthood, right? And then afterwards, what you see is a more gradual decline, right? Inductive reasoning is more of a component of crystallized intelligence. Then what you have here is verbal memory, right? And verbal memory also, what you see is that it's this orange line here, right? So again, verbal memory also seems to be peaking somewhere in middle adulthood and then slowly declining. Then you have something called spatial orientation, right? Spatial orientation is basically, how well you can sort of think about objects in space, or think about your own body in relation to the space around you, right? So spatial orientation, so it's this green line here. So it peaks a little bit, peaking in, middle adulthood or a little before that, and then declining. Numeric ability, right? Again, you see that, it's on its way to declining after middle adulthood, right? Actually before. So it starts declining at 53 years of age, right? And when you consider verbal ability, that's something that is fairly stable. So verbal ability is also something that's part of crystallized intelligence, the sort of language that you have, the sort of vocabulary that you have, how well you can use grammar, So all of these are, so that's part of crystallized intelligence. But, this is something you see and when you look at this diagram, that later in life, fluid factors, which include spatial orientation, perceptual speed, and numeric ability, right? They show a faster decline than components of crystallized intelligence. So, thinking of middle adulthood. So yes, thinking of middle adulthood only in terms of gains versus declines may not give us a very complete picture. But when we look at different components of cognition and we study how each of them is changing, that is actually a much better way, a much more nuanced way of looking at it. Right, so to sum this up, when we consider fluid intelligence, right, and when we compare it to crystallized intelligence, right, what basically is the difference here? So crystallized intelligence is made up of these components. It's basically made up of accumulated knowledge. So that's one, right? Then you have along with accumulated knowledge, you have knowledge of social conventions, right? And this goes along with having a good judgment, right? So all of these abilities really, right, are valued by a person's culture, right? So, knowledge of social conventions will differ culture by culture, but, it's knowledge of social conventions mostly is a valued sort of, it's valued knowledge in a person's culture, in any culture, even though those social conventions might be different. And then a good ability to judge, right? And accumulated knowledge regarding any particular domain, right? Then when we talk about fluid intelligence, so what exactly is fluid intelligence made up of? Whereas fluid intelligence, it's made up of basic information processing skills, right? So the components of fluid intelligence what they look like is, your capacity, working memory capacity, right? So here you have working, how many, sort of items can you hold within working memory at any given time, right? Then you have, the speed at which you can perceive and analyze information, right? And then you have another component here, which is basically this ability to detect relationships amongst visual stimuli, right? So these are all the components that fluid intelligence is made up of, and crystallized intelligence is made up of accumulated knowledge and experience, this mastery of social conventions, and goes with a good sense of judgment. Now, when we're talking about, all of these changes happening, which are cognitive in nature in middle adulthood, right? One question arises, what basically is responsible for these changes? Why are these changes happening, right? So there are different ways of explaining it. One sort of explanation for this comes from this sort of theory which is called the neural network view. So one explanation comes from this theory which we look at, and there's another which is called the information loss view. And these are basically, both of them are answering why perceptual speed is declining. Right, what exactly is perceptual speed? So, when you look at tests of perceptual speed, if you want to test your own perceptual speed, you'll basically be given questions in a test. And those questions will look something like this, right? This is not a difficult question, but you basically need to make you need to answer them in a particular given time. So basically you're looking at, how well someone can sort of size up relationships or perceive stimuli around them. What is the speed at which they can perceive and analyze information that is thrown at them, right? So when we're considering why there are declines in perceptual speed, we consider these two different views. One is something that's called the neural network view. Another is something that's called the information loss view. So according to the neural network view, what's going on is that as you're aging, right, what's happening is that connections, neural connections, right, what's happening to some of them is that they are dying, right? And as they die, right, your brain replaces them, right, with newer connections, or certain connections are made such that these, older connections may be bypassed. The older connections that have died, right, they can be bypassed. Even though these connections are bypassed, but what happens, and that basically, sort of ensures that the person is still able to accomplish that task. So, for example, the sort of question that we looked at, a person who's middle-aged, who is literate, can still answer that question, but what you'll see is that they perhaps would be able to do it a little slower. Now, what does that mean? According to the neural network view, what that means is that, or what's responsible for that, is that, the connections that they had in their brain are dying, and newer connections are being made which are bypassing those older connections, right? But these new connections are not efficient, right? And this is causing the decline that we see in perceptual speed, right? So this is according to the neural network view. What does the information loss view say about this? So basically what the information loss view posits is that, information, as it's moving through neural networks, right, as it's moving through the nervous system, it is lost, right? So, some sort of information is always being lost, but as we age, more and more information is lost. And that is why there is a decline in perceptual speed, because as you age, you're losing more and more information as it's passing through your nervous system, right? So again, to have here the decline in perceptual speed. One thing that you need to remember, though, is that there are huge individual differences when we consider this, right? There are huge individual differences in the sense that what you see is that these cognitive declines are not as profound in everyone. Now, what might be reasons for this? So one of the things, what are some factors that are implicated in certain individuals not showing the same sort of decline, whereas other individuals who are showing this, a particular kind of decline? One of the things that you see is that SES seems to be a factor, right? But SES is not the only factor. So there are other factors that are involved as well. So for example, if you have hobbies that are stimulating, for example, if you like to travel, if you like to read, right? If you like to, attend cultural events like, perhaps the Lord Literary Festival. That's one example. If you have hobbies that are intellectually stimulating, right, you have lesser chances of showing, the sort of cognitive declines that we've been talking about, or that you can slow your rate of cognitive decline, definitely, right? A lot of times these two are related, as you do see when, we talk about Lord Literary Festival. So what we see is that, people who are higher in SES sometimes have the time, they have the energy, they have the resources to indulge in a particular set of hobbies, and that can determine, their cognitive functioning. Another sort of factor that's implicated here is marriage or marital status, and especially, marriage to another individual. And, this is not just marital status, but being married for a long period of time, stable marriage. And the sort of marriage with a partner who's also high in cognitive functioning. So that also seems to play a major part in sort of delaying cognitive delays in individuals, right? What other factors can there be? What do you guys think? So, some other factors might be something like absence of chronic diseases. So perhaps we're talking about cardiovascular disease. Then it might be, so one which is interesting is having, a flexible personality, right? So that again is somehow linked with not having the same sort of decline cognitively in middle adulthood.